Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And this past weekend I went to see Project Hail Mary, a blockbuster-budget sci-fi comedy drama that marks powerhouse filmmaker duo Phil Lord and Chris Miller's return to live-action directing after 12 years, with a screenplay by Drew Goddard and starring PG-13 soft boy hero Ryan Gosling. But we won't be talking about that today because I'm still finishing out my double feature for Women's History Month, so the Blockbuster Boys Club is gonna have to wait so that I can finally get to talking about Slanted. Slanted is an indie feature film debut for writer-director Amy Wang and stars Shirley Chen as Joan Huang, a frustrated working-class Chinese-American high school senior who, after years of growing up in the almost exclusively white enclaves of affluent middle American suburbia, develops a deep toxic shame that, in turn, makes her obsessed with fitting in and being validated in the only way she believes she can, by hiding or disowning her Chinese identity as much as possible, and by playing into the classic American beauty standard of the thin, blonde, blue-eyed prom queen. Joan is a frequent user of a social media app filter called Ethnos, which, like some real-world app filters, takes her selfies and digitally alters them so that it appears as if she is white. In fact, Joan is apparently so obsessed with this app that it begins sending her spammy messages, culminating in Joan learning that this software is, in fact, just the front-facing data farming operation for an advanced plastic surgery practice that specializes in ethnic modification surgery for non-white people, so that they can have their hair, eyes, skin, literally every aspect of their body completely molecularly altered so that they do not simply have the physical traits more closely in line with affluent white patriarchal American standards of beauty, but do in fact become white people. Hence, with just exactly the wrong doses of shaming, maladaptive obsession, and even more humiliations to come via her attempts to cozy up to the dumb, rich blonde de jour of her high school, Olivia Hammond, played by Amelie Zilber. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It's not terribly surprising, nor does Wang present it as being. Joan takes the plunge and makes herself the white girl of her, or rather, I guess, more appropriately, someone else's dreams. I guess the guys who made the American Ghost in the Shell. She bites the bullet and gets the scar, Joe. They don't call it that in the film, which was just... You're just going to leave that whale sitting right there on the table? How do you not just walk into a joke like that with a premise like this? Look, I get it, Slanted isn't supposed to be a rolling out of your seat comedy or a carnival spook ride. This is a lot less like Asian Get Out than it is more like Asian Sorry to Bother You, which is not nothing, I want to be clear, but I'm afraid that in its own attempts to be funny, this production kind of tries parodying and satirizing more than it can back up, because what, you're not going to have some moment where the evil whiteified plastic surgeon references the most obvious example of Asian whitewashing in Western cinema in recent memory? But he is going to encourage Joan to try going to see Michael Bublé so she can fully experience his power as a white person. At this point, I've heard names like Michael Bublé used as the punchlines of stuff white people like jokes more than I've encountered. Actually, I've never met a single white person in my life who has listened to enough Michael Bublé to even bring them up in conversation. It's not just a cheap joke, it's just bad comedy writing. It's the stuff I'd expect to hear in a comedy movie of a much lower caliber of expectations. And it's ultimately unfortunate that even a lazy gag like that can kind of set the tenor of everything that just doesn't work about a production like Slanted. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of stuff that works very well in this movie, though I must say, as this small production has started catching a not unremarkable word of mouth momentum online, line, I really find it rather patronizing in the way that just because there's a mad science and body modification element of the story, you see a lot of folks automating to the mean of describing it as body horror. But I don't really see Wang's vision as being consistent with body horror any more than I see any horror sci-fi about interdimensional monsters with tentacles as being cosmic horror. These terms don't just describe superficial content, people. Genres also have sensual dimensions to them. And the sense that I get from Slanted is that while there are certainly some grisly practical effects here and there, Wang isn't really playing in the territory of anything corporeal, even with the ethnic modification theme, which is a form of plastic surgery that is absolutely factual, and you see especially represented among Asians and Asian Americans who seek to surgically widen their eyes or remove epicanthic folds from their eyelids, hence the double entendre of the title Slanted. Wang just doesn't really ever go under the knife with Slanted. She doesn't seem nearly as interested in speculating on the grotesque potential of the body when altered. Not unlike Malaysian filmmaker Amanda Nelu's own Tiger Stripes, which was similarly pigeonholed as body horror, I believe Slanted is better understood through a mystical lens than a corporeal one. This is not a movie about the grotesque potential of body modification or the externalization of interior corruption with a new kind of physiognomy. It is, if anything, more of a postmodern fairy tale, a scandalized reworking of the Cinderella story, complete with a poor heroine with cleaning apron and gloves who wants more than anything than to go to the grand ball and get her Prince Charming. When you're watching Slanted, to appreciate it fully, to especially get the most out of how Wang and Chen managed to paint such a sensitive and sympathetic portrait of a character who shouldn't feel so terribly relatable. Not because of the roots of her obsessions, but because she isn't so terribly complex. There is kind of this deliberate seeming fairy tale princess pattern to everything she does that should make it very hard to really relate to her, but because this isn't really a body horror movie, Wang spends much more time simply following Chen's facial performance, her gaze, her gradients of shrewd cunning and desperate people-pleasing, and then regression into despair. When you're following this study in this character, I don't think you're going to find yourself nearly as impressed by it if you're hoping for something like Cronenberg, when really you should be thinking Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen. The most visceral this thing gets is when it is, again, less about what is happening to Joan's body as it is what is happening to her soul behind those eyes, and consistent with those 18th century fairy tales, the moralistic punishment that comes for all corrupted and unfortunate souls is not one to be trifled with. There's a real grueling finish to Slanted that I applaud Wang for committing to the fullest. But that's the thing. The best attributes of Slanted are the ones that play to those strengths of mysticality and a rather refreshingly clear sense of morality as part of the narrative, which can be increasingly hard to come by in these times of jaded antipathy and culture war and grievance politics. While I understand the terms the film is working on in that arena of the kind of heightened, semi-surreal in which ethnicity-swapping social media apps send out messages that call you to a hidden laboratory behind the facade of an abandoned strip mall storefront where the high school prom queens and prom kings of yesteryear are not just framed in small photos, but are literally rendered in these huge gold-framed portraits like the gallery of a castle, where if you pay close enough attention, you realize that the mascot of the school football team is literally a Klansman. Slanted is exactly the sort of movie that shackles itself to living and dying on the sympathy of a primarily either cosmopolitan or terminally online audience that is going to take the same implicit implicit biases that make it a trial by catching hell to even make it as a political minority in media, and just reframe them into a kind of sympathetic dummy smile where you nod about how important and progressive it is, when what you really mean is that it says all of the obvious things that you expect to hear. It makes all the obvious jokes that you expect it to make, and then call it satire when inevitably the exact sort of production that already faces exponentially more difficult hurdles getting to a larger audience ends up passing along fleetingly in the streaming night because it just doesn't have the salience to make it an effective indie movie hit. People will call Slanted body horror, and they'll call it satire, or at least satiric, but it's simply playing to the cheap seats as far as peddling this easy target of parody, the ideal white woman when... I'm sorry, there are definitely idealized standards of femininity within white supremacy, but if you've got Joan as a character idolizing this specific rich white classmate who has a supermodel body and eats nothing but kale, the salience of a satire goes out the window, because regardless of race, I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark that, again, way more people have seen that character as a stereotype in movies than they have encountered in their real life to any meaningful degree that even most white people would look at them and say, oh yeah, that's a real ideal kind of lady. That's real. That's representative. That's the catch-22 that I'm finding with a lot of these sorts of socio-political genre movies within the last 10 years, especially since Get Out basically blew the doors off. Addressing not just a theme of how people of color experience racism and white supremacy, but how they attempt to represent whiteness when the whole point is that whiteness can always play itself. That whiteness is simultaneously ideal in and of itself without it actually having to represent anything ideal. So Amy Wang ends up crafting this sorry to bother you-esque semi-surreal world in which, like, white people don't appropriate enough from other people's cultures for Joan to have anything but white pop stars and actresses plastered all over her walls, or for these affluent rich white kids to, like, eat anything but kale and bleached white rice and chicken. And it's like, dog, I grew up upper middle class and going to private school. I know my rich white freaks. And let me tell you, the main hallmark of being on the outside that affluent white ideal is that you don't think about being white enough to not go crazy over the latest rap star like Lil Wayne, and you have more privilege in terms of disposable currency and free time to hang out at the strip mall, often with the highlight of that day being overexpensive ethnic food. I was wealthy, but we were still you have food at home wealthy. I ate more typical white people slop than richer kids I knew. You can say whatever you want about satire or satirical framing, but I don't think that's what Slanted is. I think it's a perfectly good 21st century fairy tale with a novel concept that is shot and performed with an expert balance between fluid, sensitive description of the emotional journey of its young characters, punctuated by just the right moments of stylistic flair that keep us feeling grounded no matter how heightened the context might be. But on the way to all of those great things, it also just turns out to be a shallow, shabby, predictable parody of whiteness and white supremacy than it is an effective satire of it. In being so obvious, Slanted finds itself stranded in that same vague territory of oversaturated socio-political genre films where it feels like somebody wrote the essay analyzing the film before they wrote the film itself, where it can only say and address the most surface-level qualities of white supremacy as an ideology, much like the more visceral elements being mistaken for body horror. It doesn't actually get into the guts of ideology to try to dare to carry them to their logical, salient extreme, one where you accept the inherent risk that lots of people aren't going to get it because they are so deep within the sunken place of exactly the sorts of hegemonic values you're trying to excoriate. Good Good satire risks the misunderstanding of it in order to illustrate a more important social point about the audience watching it, what they will accept, how far they are willing to go before they ever start asking questions. Whereas Slanted can only aggressively and predictably parody whiteness because beneath it all, there is implicitly a kind of reactionary tenor to Wang's vision. It reifies ideals of whiteness that are more convenient to not addressing it. Even the hot topic of cultural appropriation goes right out the window if it's not malleable enough to this juvenile reaffirmation of teen movie stereotypes predominantly invented by white filmmakers, and which actually mystifies whiteness more than it explains why it's such a captivating object of desire for someone like Joan. Temporarily embarrassed fairy tale princess or not, Joan is painted into a corner by this movie because she's chasing an idealized mode of representation via whiteness, when the whole point, one that's explicitly addressed by the mad surgeon character in Wang's film, is that the ideal of whiteness is invisibility, the lack of definitive designation of values apart from the role of neutral agent in one's own life. Slanted says the thing we're all expecting to hear in its dialogue, but that's objectively not what the movie is about. It's about a heroine who yearns to be seen, and you can write that off as, oh, it's a heightened story, it's semi-surreal, it's a satire. That's not satire. That's just parody, and a stale parody at that. It's one of those sorts of indie genre films where I just sort of have to stand on my confidence that the only marginal salience it will have is among those who already have the motivated reasoning to not only support films by political minorities, but to exploit them, to extract from them, to culturally appropriate them, to get something out of them as just a new hat put on an old school exploitation film cycle.
It's true! It's true! We're so lame!
I'm giving Slanted a 3 out of 5, and with that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.